time to start in on our second natural philosopher. Like Empedocles, this guy's going to be really wealthy, well off, have plenty of leisure time so he can participate in this. His name is Democritus. He is a philosopher from Thrace, and he is sort of reacting to a claim made by a different philosopher. I suspect the answer to this is no, but has anyone heard of Zeno's paradox? Probably not. Oh, we got a couple people! Jacob, can you explain to us what Zeno's paradox is?
No, I've just heard of it.
Okay, you've heard of it. Alright, here's Zeno's paradox. Zeno is trying to say, hey, motion's impossible, it can't be done. And his argument for why motion is impossible is as follows. Zeno says, okay, imagine you fire an arrow, right? You're shooting an arrow somewhere. In order for the arrow to hit its target, first it has to make it halfway to its target. And before it can make it halfway to its target, it has to make it a quarter of the way to its target. And before it can make it a quarter of its way to its target, it has to make it an eighth of the way to its target. And before it can do that, it has to go a 16th and a 32nd and a 64th, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And therefore, it can never reach its target because there's always a smaller amount of distance that it has to cover first. So this is something called Zeno's paradox. And he's arguing against the existence of motion.
But he's seen things move.
Yes. Democritus listens to this argument and says, no, that's clearly nonsense, we can see things move. But it's not enough to go into a rap battle and say, well, that's obviously not true because look at me walking back and forth. It doesn't make a very compelling argument in the forum. So here is Democritus' philosophy on what actually is going on. Democritus says, all right, imagine you have an object and you cut it in half. Like we've got a hunk of gold, you cut it in half, you have 2 hunks of gold. Okay? We can cut that in half, we've got 4 hunks of gold. You can keep cutting it smaller and smaller and smaller. But eventually, there is a smallest possible object beyond which you can't cut it anymore. He says there's a smallest possible piece of a thing. He called that smallest possible piece of a thing the uncuttable, the indivisible, that which can't be sliced any further. And the Greek word for that, the Greek word for not, is a. Think like atypical, right? That means not typical. And then the word for cuttable is tomos. So the Greek word for the uncuttable is atomos. Atom.
Oh.
Yeah?
So the atom is a thing that was made by this guy who just was arguing against motion?
He's arguing that motion does exist. He's basically saying Zeno doesn't know what he's talking about.
He's a cuckoo bananas guy?
Democritus actually comes kind of shocking.
No, Zeno.
Oh, Zeno, yeah. Zeno's paradox is, I agree with Democritus in thinking that Zeno's paradox is dumb. But I would probably also lose a rap battle in the town square about why Zeno's paradox is dumb. Because it's not enough to have evidence or a better, or to actually be right. You have to be able to present your argument. All right. So, yes,
Is this where democracy comes from?
this is actually not where democracy comes from. Democritus is from Thrace. And democracy is first, like our modern conception of democracy is first done in Athens. The word demo means people. So, and krasi means government. Think like theocracy is government by religion. Autocracy is government by like an individual or strongman. Democracy is government by the people, right? So words that have krasi or archy are usually the words that talk about government. So here we have the demo part of the name, but not the government part of the name. We've got the part of the name that means people. Yes?
Wait, so what does he do? What does Democritus do?
Democritus
He's the one that's
is a natural philosopher. He's the one who says there's the smallest possible piece, and you can't cut any farther.
But he's not the one that's saying cut it in half
The guy who says you can't get anywhere because there's always a smaller distance is Zeno, and Democritus doesn't like Zeno.
What? So Democritus' thing is you can't. There's a limit to how much you can cut.
Yeah. He says there's the smallest possible thing. And he names that smallest possible thing the atom, the uncuttable.
So he made the atom.
He's the one who comes up with the concept of the atom. Now, it's worth noting, he doesn't have the ability to actually do any experiments or see atoms or have any he has no physical evidence. He's got no actual experiments.
There
of
was
the
no way to
existence
prove
of
that he
atoms.
was right, but he was right.
He just happens to have stumbled upon something very close to the truth, and so his word is the word we use to describe this real thing that actually exists. Chef.
How do we know this guy is like real? It's from 460 BC.
We have writings about it. Yeah. So we do have written history that survived. It's not always the actual things that he wrote, but people wrote about him. But yeah, there's a lot of ancient historians, and we know that many of these figures from history did exist because we have writings about them from other people. Now, it's important to remember, sometimes the writings we have about a person say, so-and-so was a god, or so-and-so wasn't a god, he jumped into a volcano and it was all a trick. And are those stories true? Probably not. But there is information in the stories themselves, right? When somebody has a story about Empedocles not really being a god, we can infer from that somebody was arguing that he was, right? So, ancient histories, are they always super accurate and true?
No.
No. But they tell us something about what the author was trying to say regardless, right? Knowing the stories that people told is interesting in and of itself, even if they're lying. All right. So Democritus says there's got to be a limit. You can't just keep cutting. There's the smallest possible piece of something, and that something is the atom. He thought atoms were tiny spheres. To this day, many of the models that we use for atoms are going to be tiny spheres. Later on in our chemistry class, I will have you building things out of little spheres that represent different types of atoms. So his model is kind of eerily close to the truth, even though he didn't have any experimental evidence to remind us. Yes, Chef?
This is why we call it the atom.
This is why we call it the atom. This is where the word atom comes from. And the definition of what an atom is an atom is the smallest piece of a substance that is still that substance. So you can't cut it any further and still be that thick. If I have a hunk of gold, I can cut it in half and I have 2 hunks of gold. But once I get down to a gold atom, I can't cut that anymore and still have gold. Yes, Joaquin?
Wait, how is number 3 shown up?
Number 3 has not shown up yet. I said
it's
1,
1,
2,
2,
4, and 7. So we can take a moment and talk about where we've seen these.
Yeah.
So when I talk about model of the atom, raise your hand. Who can tell me where point number 1 has come up so far today?
This guy.
Yeah, this guy, Democritus, right? He gives us our first model of the atom, the smallest piece of a thing, the uncuttable. Okay? Who can tell me where number 2, this question of how has our view of elements changed over time, showed up? Please.
What's this guy's name again? Empedocles.
Empedocles, yeah, Empedocles is the one who originates this concept of elements. And remember, so an element is a type of matter from which we can build other things. So the idea behind an element is there's only a handful of different types of substance, but you can combine them to create multiple things. So, there's only fire, earth, air, and water, but from them we can make things like feathers and wood and all the stuff that exists. Who can tell me about point number 4? How has the way science is done changed over time? How has that shown up? Carl?
Instead of the scientific process this came.
Yeah.
It used to be you just made a claim and had to prove it.
So Democritus, so you just put both of them on number 4?
Yeah, well, I would say specifically everything about natural philosophy and how natural philosophy works is an example of number 4, because natural philosophy gives us our precursor to science. What about number 7? How has identity impacted whose voices we hear in science? Where has that shown up today?
It's when only rich people in time could be philosophers.
Right, so we have some class issues and who gets to do it, right? First of all, you can't be a laborer or somebody, you can't be enslaved, you can't be a laborer, you can't be somebody who has to work for a living. Where else has that shown up? Yossi?
Well, at the beginning, how you said that many people's stories were cut out,
Yeah.
of history.
So even like at the meta level, just going into this lecture series, in order for me to tell you about somebody, I basically only looked at like individuals with compelling stories. So if you either weren't an individual or if your story was destroyed, we didn't get to hear you. Gender also showed up a little bit, right? If you're, say, a Greek woman, you wouldn't have free time even if you were wealthy because you'd be doing economics, right? You'd be managing your household. So we have these things showing up in our work.